Emmerdale, where I'm conducting a PhD study. I have been involved with several equine studies investigating mineral balances and microbiology in the hindgut of horses. But over the last year, I developed a keen interest in the kind of the bigger picture, so going back to basics and investigating foraging behavior and diet selection in horses. And this is particularly an area that has not been studied a lot. And so there are a number of aspects that I'm researching, but I'm particularly interested in examining the role of smell, taste, and post-ingestive feedback in the recognition of food by horses. That sounds a lot, but there will be some aspects in this presentation that kind of link back to this study. So I'm very excited to share some of that, of those data with you guys. At the end of this presentation, I will provide you with some more information about the consultancy, so MB Equine Services. So yeah, let's get started with the webinar. Throughout the webinar, we'll have small breaks where we allow some time for questions. So the seminar is focusing on pasture species, and this is generally considered to be a bit of a boring topic. So I therefore would like to start first with a discussion on good plants and bad plants, because there's a lot of misunderstanding about what roles plants play and what they provide to grazing animals. We will then briefly discuss the structure and carbohydrate metabolism. This is one of those subjects that horse owners are most interested in and would like to know more about, because they are dealing or managing with managing sugar-sensitive horses. And this will be followed then by an overview of common pasture species, and we will finish off with the importance of biodiversity. And at the end, we'll have a final question and answer part. So we have a tendency generally to label plants in our pastures as good and bad, and the weeds generally are bad and the grasses are good. But there are no such things as bad and good plants, because each plant has its own needs, and when the conditions are right, they will grow and occupy this habitat. And generally it's very easy to hate something, particular a weed, but you may have not thought about that sometimes the problem is actually the solution. So for example, if we have here the thistle plant, it is a plant with deep taproots, and if you slash it rather than spraying it, you can actually use the roots to break down compacted layers of soil, aerate it, and then at the same time you're putting back minerals or nutrients into the soil. And at the other side, there's a lot of understanding, or there's a bit of misunderstanding. Most people think that there are only some plants that have toxins and are bad for horses or in general to grazing animals. However, all plants contain toxins, and this is where the confusion generally starts. So toxins are also called secondary plant compounds, and I'm having a slide with a couple of examples. It's a big list. I don't want to kind of go through them, but I just want to highlight that there are many species that have different types of toxins. So alkaloids, we find probably a couple that you're familiar with, such as ryegrass, barley, millets, even oats. Then we have grasses or plants that have cyanide properties, such as fescue, wheat, and corn. And you can go down this list and you will find that most grasses will have some of these toxins. However, even some foods that we are eating have toxins, but we have selected them over many years for lower levels, and that's also a little bit what we see in some of the grasses that we're using for grazing animals. One of the other things that we have to consider is that all plants contain toxins, but there are only a few that are poisonous. So that is what I want to highlight here with this figure. And the idea is that most toxins in plants limit the intake and cause animals to eat a variety of foods. However, you do want to read up on some of the poisonous plants on your property or in your pasture. And so there is for Australia a nice publication from Rurdik where they highlight some plants and weeds that are considered poisonous to horses. So we will provide you with a link in an email later on where you can read up more about it. But on the other hand, I also want to highlight that you should be aware that toxic plants may become an issue if you have monoculture situations in your paddock. So if the horse doesn't have any options and is kind of forced to only consume one particular plant, then we can get a toxicity problem. So it's not the actual plant that's the problem, but not having enough choice can be dangerous for grazing animals. So I hope that I clarified that a little bit before we kind of continue and talk about individual grasses. So which plants do animals prefer? And this kind of links a little bit back with the toxin story. So we kind of wonder, why do we start with toxins? But this links back to how animals make dietary choices. And if you just look at the pictures on the side from the horse and the cow, you may be familiar with this kind of behavior. And we see grazing animals do a lot of effort to get to some kind of plant on the other side of the fence. And this is not only to reduce maybe potential toxins, but also for nutrients, so-called primary compounds, or just for the pure flavor of it, which would we call a hedonic effect. So that is highlighted here in this kind of graph. So we call this the satiety theory. So that is based on these three main compounds. So primary compounds, so for instance, protein, carbohydrates and lipids, flavor, which can be salty or sweet, and then we have secondary compounds, which I refer to as the toxins. So any of these aspects can change diet selection or can modulate behavior, foraging behavior. So I'm not going to go in too much detail in this, but I want you to remember this slide because we'll come back to this satiety theory a little bit later on. So I want to come back and discuss this a little bit more in detail later. But before we start with discussing the plant structures, are there any questions? Sorry, that just that just went too quick. Before we start with the plant structures, are there any questions about this section regarding toxins and poisonous plants?
Hi, Mariette.
So this was kind of a bit of a quicker. Hi.
Yeah, hello. I'm just saying I haven't had any questions from anyone yet, so feel free to type in the question box or the chat box if you have them. And if we don't get to all the questions, then we can send them to Mariette to answer after the webinar. But we'd like to see chat happening and some questions happening. Thank you, Mariette.
Okay, thanks, Julie. So plant structures and development. So in this seminar, we will focus mainly on the grass family, but I will briefly highlight legume development and some species later on. So a little bit background on the grass family, which is named Poaceae or Graminae, and there are over 600 genera and lots of species, as you can see, which I highlighted in this in the dot points. Grasses has evolved around 55 million years ago, and around that time, browsing animals may have started to utilize these grasses as a food source. And if you're interested in the evolution of the horse, around the same time, we see that horse species show kind of a shift, particularly in the morphology of their bone structures, so their skeleton, and particularly their skull and teeth. So what we see is that horses went kind of from a browsing diet to a more mixed feeding to a kind of a more primary grazing diet, and that's what you can see, for instance, also in the teeth, like the morphology of the teeth. So grasses come in a number of shapes and sizes. We have them from very small herbs to the biggest grass on the planet is bamboo. I have here a really nice picture of that. That's indeed about 130 feet tall, very tall grass. You may never have thought about the significance of grass, but it has a quite important economic importance. And as you can see, I highlighted a couple of things that where we use grasses for. So starch, so of course we eat on a daily basis either rice, bread, your pasta. Alcohol, it's a very popular, popular drink by most people. and also as a fuel. So ethanol fuel has become very popular as well, using a particular corn. And then it highlights also that grazing animals, so because I already highlighted that most of the plants contain toxins, but only few are really poisonous. So it makes it a real good food for grazing animals. Now we come kind of in a little bit the boring bit, which is the development. Well, most bunch grasses have the same morphology. So leaves are grown from its stem to gather sunlight and CO2, and together with water it converts it to carbohydrates, which is what we refer to as the photosynthesis process. So you may be familiar with this. Then the carbohydrates are transported via the leaf sheath to the stem, which is channeling it to the roots or to the seed heads, and depending on the phase of growth, it will either channel it to the roots, or it will channel it to the seed head, depending on the stage of growth. We'll highlight those different phases in the next slide. The seed head develops at the base of the stem and grows with the stem to its full height, and we'll call that generally just before it pops up the boot stage, and I will show that in the next slide. The crown the crown connects the roots, and in some species, new shoots called thylles may form at the crown, and this is called the vegetative or the asexual reproduction of the plant. These are generally creeping grasses, so you may be familiar, for instance, like a kikuya, you'll see all these kind of thylles creeping over the soil. But still, these plants can also form seeds, so we still have what we call the sexual reproduction. And I have here that slide that really illustrates these phases. So bunch grasses go through these three phases. So we have the vegetative stage, which is just adding more leaf matter to capture sunlight, which is then followed by this elongation phase, where the stem lengthens, and this results then in that boot stage. That's this part where just the seed head pops up, and then it ends up in the reproductive phase, where you can see this where it fully flowers. So we're all kind of, we're quite familiar with this, and I'm just kind of go through this just to kind of get the background of grass development. So legumes actually grow slightly different. There is no separate elongation phase, and they go from a vegetative stage to an early reproduction stage, which we call the bud stage. And so the stem and leaves grow together, and even at the branch level. And you can see that very well here with clover species. So flowers can be formed at the main stem as well as on the main stem and on the branches. So also what we see generally in legumes is that there are some different types of growth. So here we have, I'm not so sure what happened there. I apologize for the technical problems. So for instance, with the clover, we see more of a creeper kind of close to the ground growth, whether, for instance, lucerne has a more vertical growth. That makes it also very hard with some of these legumes, in particular clover, to slash it. And I think that if you're dealing with a lot of clover, that you probably are quite familiar with that issue. So again, a bit of a quick overview. And before we discuss the grass growth and carbohydrate metabolism, are there any questions about structure? Kind of the bit boring bit.
I have two questions here, Mariette, but they're both relating to horses' taste and choice of plants. So I think we're covering that a little bit later, aren't we?
Yes, we can. We are when we get to the biodiversity. I'm more than happy to go a little bit more into this diet selection mechanism, so look at that satiety theory and elaborate a little bit more on that.
Yes.
Would that be okay?
All right, I
then
think so,
it links all quite together.
Mm-hmm.
Because we're really kind of going into kind of the grass growth and carbohydrates, particularly this part may be of interest for horse owners that are dealing with sugar-sensitive horses, and I always get a lot of questions in this section. So Okay, so next slide. Well, grasses, as we know, go to different phases, and I have here an illustration that really highlights this leaf production, because recent research is really showing that it's actually the leaves that grow on that determine, for instance, the water-soluble carbohydrate part. So after the plant reaches a reproductive stage, leaf material will die and become kind of mulch and return to the soil. So we are aware that the plants go through these different phases, and that this is dependent by sunlight and, of course, influenced by season. So here we have an example of ryegrass, and we really particularly want to discuss the water-soluble carbohydrate level, which is the energy level. Water-soluble carbohydrate just means indeed that it's soluble in water, and that it's what we refer to the simple sugars, or it falls under the non-structural carbohydrates. That may be also a term that you hear often. And non-structural carbohydrates can be divided in a number of different carbohydrate paths, and water-soluble carbohydrate is one of those. If you ever have done a feed test, or like a hay test or a grass test, you may have encountered this this carbohydrate level. So if we look at the first, if we look at particularly the figure, is that from the process of photosynthesis in sunlight, tylers form glucose and other water-soluble carbohydrates in the leaves. And these are used to provide energy for ongoing growth and respiration. What is not immediately used for growth or respiration is stored, mainly in the lower portions of the tylers, and then it's reused when needed. And these soluble carbohydrates are particularly important for the plant to sustain its growth. And when there's no sunlight, it's unable to provide enough energy to meet the plant's demands. And particular following grazing, cloudy conditions, or as I said, at night, which makes it very hard for the plant to mobilize this energy. Regrowth of ryegrass tylers and the change in water-soluble carbohydrates are highlighted here. And I want to kind of go through these 4 stages. So if we take this as that the plant was grazed, the tyler's first priority is always to reestablish its energy factory by regrowing leaves. So leaves is really important. To be able to survive, you need to push out leaves. So when this is happening, it really burns up to be able to survive, it really burns up all these carbohydrates. So either by roots or by tylers. Water-soluble carbohydrates are mobilized from the remaining, so if things die, so for instance the roots or the tylers are dying, then it's mobilized from remaining tylers or the stubble to provide energy for regrowth. And we'll get a little bit later to the effect of stress on plants and how this affects, for instance, regrowth. So the first leaf is generally pushed out to get more sunlight to make, together with water, more carbohydrates. So that's the first priority of the plant. By the second stage, which is what we call the second leaf stage, it expands and it allows more water-soluble carbohydrates to be formed from the photosynthesis process. This is used for the growth of the leaf, and none is stored. So at this stage, all is used to mobilize for grass growth. The tyler is still using some of these carbohydrates as the reserves, but it's not till the first leaf stage when carbohydrates being stored. So it's kind of a bit of a balance between the first and the second leaf. So energy is needed for the growth, but at the same time, it needs also to maintain root health. So at this stage, the plant is most vulnerable for regrazing because it really is putting a lot of energy in this defining this energy. So it's important that at that stage you don't regraze it, and that is probably the problem when we get into the overgrazing. So when we get to the third stage, then we add more, well, if the plant has the opportunity to grow more leaves, then we see that the production of, well, the storage of the water-soluble carbohydrates are increasing. As you can see here on the lower part, that's kind of the diagram of the level of soluble carbohydrates over time with these, getting to the fourth leaf stage. So at this stage, the plant can start also developing more root systems, so it is able to store more sugars, and it can also invest better into the regrowth. When we get into the fourth stage, the oldest leaf begins to die, so it is investing into the thylus, and the quality begins to decline. So when it has enough leaf matter, then it starts to kind of level out or decline, especially when it starts to develop its seed head. So that's kind of getting into that reproduction phase. So that's just kind of a little bit of a brief overview of what carbohydrates do over time with the add-on of leaves. This can be quite complex, and but it's just to highlight that plants have this that sugars are very important, and that the plant is trying to restore its levels.
Hi, Mariette. Excuse me, we've just got a question relating to that slide. What is the greater stressor on grass? Overgrazing, compaction, or drought?
Yes, they're all stresses. Periods of stress, such as heat and frost and drought, can all really affect the growth of the grass. And what we see is that if leaf matter is taken, then it starts to really accumulate in the stem some of the carbohydrates. Probably overgrazing, but overgrazing will lead to compaction, so it's kind of almost together. And then drought generally just doesn't allow the plant to really get to that stage to produce more leaf matter. There's no water, so it cannot, first of all, cannot grow more leaves. It's in a dormant phase generally. And then it's also, dealing with this reduced carbohydrate storage. So both really stresses out the plant, and both can accumulate during that time quite a lot of sugar in the lower part of the stem. And if, for instance, horses are continuously grazing on stressed grasses, either due to overgrazing or drought, it will really, it can actually add more sugar. It can actually have a higher sugar intake than when it gets into more of a vegetative state. So I hope I clarified that, and that indeed that we want to manage that in the right way, so that we're not stressing out the grass and putting potentially particular sugar sensitivity horses at risk for this this high intake. I will show another slide later on where I really address this overgrazing. So here is a slide on optimal grazing window, and what I want to highlight here is how does this growth affect the quality of grasses and legumes. So as you can see here in the figure, we have here the grass growth stages, so going from that leafy stage to that flowering state, coming into full vegetative state, into the reproductive phase. And what we see is that in the beginning, the protein and minerals are good and high, and this declines when more leaf matter is added, which we call, the lignification happens. So it adds more fiber, so more structural carbohydrates and lignin to it. So, and for most graziers, we want to have this optimal window, which I just shift to the next one, that is pretty much between the leafy stage and this just this heading stage. This is pretty much the standard optimal grazing window for cattle and sheep. However, that's also, if you can just look at the little graphs at the bottom, the protein and the non-structural carbohydrate. This is when it's at its peak, which could be potentially be a bit dangerous for for horses. So generally we would like to see either just that we slash it before heading. That can help with reducing these carbohydrates being pushed into the stem and kind of motivate more regrowth. So you kind of reallocate this energy. Instead of the seed head, it goes back into growing more leaves. And the other stage is just past heading. When it gets to more to the reproduction phase, that's generally a nice time for horse owners to make hay, because it generally is high in fiber. As you can see, it really gets to that peak of fiber, and then the sugars are dropping. So I just want to highlight that. However, with that, it's a bit of a catch-22, because if we increase fiber, we kind of reduce the palatability of the food. So that's where it's a bit tricky with horses, because they do have kind of a sweet tooth. But that would be the best period for making hay. Of course, this is of course, I'm now highlighting a lot sugar-sensitive horses. But if you're dealing with breeding horses or growing horses, you want to kind of capture this quality, and you want to probably mow your grass a little bit earlier for hay production. And this will help also with determining at which time you want to graze the animal. So here is that picture actually, which really shows that leaf area management. So if we compare these two plants, plant A is overgrazed, so stressed. To just come back to that question. And as you can see, whatever happens above ground will happen below ground. So what we see is that when you take a lot of leaf matter away, this will also cause roots to die, to kind of have an equal kind of 50-50%. This is to reduce, of course, energy, to push energy through your root system to this really small stubble. And as you can see, if we compare it to plant B, which some leaf matter was left on, it still has a quite healthy root system and will be able to quickly recover over, well, they have here an example of 15 days. And when we compare that with plant A, it is still kind of struggling. It's still almost in the beginning of, after kind of extended grazing period with plant B. So this really highlights that by doing this, it makes the plant very susceptible to, of course, that it loses its this root system, so it gets also to a point where probably if it's overgrazed, it will also add potentially compaction, which makes it harder for the roots to actually penetrate through the soil layers and get some water, and then it will die off and you get these patches, and you probably are having some areas in your paddock where you can really see the effect of compaction, particularly in your corners where horses may wait for at the gate. So that was kind of in a very short way a little bit the effect of carbohydrates, and there's a lot to discuss or to do a breakdown of all the carbohydrates, but I didn't really want to bore you on that part. So if you have any questions particular about carbohydrates, or if I didn't really illustrate it in a more detailed manner, this allows to discuss that. So if you have any questions on this part.
Yep. Oh, hi, Mariette. Yes, I have a longish question. I've been revegetating my property with plants of provenance, including native grasses. I've recently read that a combination of native grasses such as wallaby, wheat and weeping grasses are great for horse pastures because they are palatable, low maintenance, nutritious, but importantly lower in sugar, carbohydrates, and therefore reduce problems with laminitis. Do you have any comments about entirely native grass pastures for horses?
That's a really interesting point and a very good point, and this is probably also, this is probably where a lot of people would like to go, like totally change their pastures to a more native grass system. So that is actually where I want to get into now, because we have to discuss the C3 and C4 grasses, and I will discuss then particularly the native grasses. So do you want me to come back to this question?
Yeah, perhaps come back to it. We've also got one more question that may suit this section. in relation to hay, the traditional time to cut hay is at the heading/bloom stage, but there is now talk of low NSC hay being cut earlier. What and how do you test hay paddocks for optimum WSC/NSC? Do you need scientific instruments, or is it simply cut early in the day?
Yeah, very interesting, very good question. So you can do, of course, your analysis, so you can take samples and you can send that to labs to kind of get a bit of an idea of how much your non-structural carbohydrate concentrations are. So generally it's divided in water-soluble carbohydrates and ethanol-soluble carbohydrates. And that's something that you will see. Of course, you have your starch, and then you have these two breakdowns of these non-structural carbohydrates, and that will give a bit of an indication of what is currently present in the grass. But those samples may take probably, to say 2 weeks if you would send it to the US. I generally use labs in the US because the prices here in Australia are quite high. And I can probably get this back in 2 weeks. So it is takes a bit of time to make a decision based on kind of analytical, analytical data. But what we do see is that just before the heading, when you had the plant, so just when you get to that boot stage, then what you do is that you allow the plant to reallocate that energy to making leaf matter. So it will reduce in the stem and it will be reallocated for leaf production. And this is generally what really will help with reducing your carbohydrates. Or you need to just do it just after. But as I said, that will really reduce kind of that the nutritional quality. So indeed, just around this area, that will be ideal because the carbohydrates are just going to kind of drop again. But because you're kind of manipulating the carbohydrate metabolism system in the plant, you kind of redirect the carbohydrates. And indeed, you could, for instance, just cut early morning when the plant just comes out of the respiration, have been using up the energy, then cut it and then dry it. So that is also indeed a good strategy. So I hope I kind of addressed that.
Okay, thank you.
There was something else in that question. I'm not so sure. I was thinking about it, and then I was like, oh, I will come back to that later, but now I forgot what that was. But yeah, so indeed, it's a little bit tricky. So some people say you need to just be heading, just cut just after this, when it just at the boot stage. Because when you get a lot of flower, generally not a lot of horses like that, a lot of seeds. Depends also on the species. Some are very hairy and spiky. So you either want to be on this side of the line or on that side of the line. But if you're on this side of the line, you need to be very aware that you do it just before the boot stage, or you slash it at a high level, let it invest in the leaves, and then mow it. Or if you're more interested in the fiber part, less sugar, then probably it will be safer to be here, but it makes it all a little bit less tasty for the horses, depending on the species. And we'll actually go into that now. So, any more questions, or did I?
I think thank you, Mariette. I think we'll move on, and then we've got some questions for later on in the presentation.
Yeah, it links all a little bit together, so we have to kind of go to some of these boring bits. But well, we have generally we divide plants, so grasses and legumes, in two classes. So we have here the C3 and C plants, and they are adapted to different climates. So first of all, C3 and C4 stand for how the plant captures carbon from the atmosphere. So the C3 plants are more adapted to a cool climate, and if you're in the kind of south of Australia, you will be having more C3 species. And when you're in the north of Queensland, northern New South Wales and Queensland and northern Western Australia, we will get into more C4 plants that are adapted to a warm or hot seasonal conditions. But you have many regions in Australia where you can find both species, and that's not very uncommon, and it's actually very favorable, which I will explain a little bit later. Yeah, well, actually, this is I'm going a little bit early. This is indeed highlighting the growth, the growth curves of those species. So as you can see, the cool season grasses have their peak just between spring and summer. That's when they are at their highest peak of production. And when we look at the warm season grasses, this shifts to more summer, between summer and autumn. And then we have legumes. They generally grow throughout the year. But they still have a slight peak in spring. And as you can see, it's quite ideal to have both species because it encourages more biomass growth over the year. So it allows you to have more resource availability throughout the year. And you want to kind of have all of these species there. So let's go now individually. So let's discuss the three classes. So we have temperate species, tropical species, and I will discuss separately these native species. And then I will come back to this question. So C3 grasses generally form fructan as their storage carbohydrate. And this acts like an antifreeze. So these plants can withstand frost conditions. So that's why we find them generally in these cool conditions. However, we have some Australian native grasses that are classified as C3, but they don't store their carbohydrates as fructans, but instead they use starch. And I just highlighted here three examples. So weeping grass, speargrass, and wallaby grass. You may be familiar with these. So many people ask me, well, which species really are accumulating high amounts of these non-structural carbohydrates? And there are actually quite a lot of species. So most of these are your introduced species, and you will be familiar with, of course, your ryegrass, cocksfoot, tall fescue, and then your legume clover. So any of these species can accumulate high amounts of these non-structural carbohydrates, but it may also depend a little bit if they're stressed or not. However, it doesn't say that you cannot use it. It's just that if you have monocultures of these grasses, then you can put horses at risk that are sugar sensitive for either laminitis or equine metabolic syndrome, so obesity or insulin resistance. So I want to highlight here a couple of more species that you may be familiar with. So all of these are introduced. Yorkshire fog, Timothy, Polaris. You may have these. Species that are really useful because a lot of people ask me, well, which C3 grasses are good for horses and accumulate low to medium carbohydrates, and that's particular prairie grass, Timothy, and Phalaris. So these lower pictures here, these are generally quite good in horse pastures, and they're quite tasty as well, particular prairie grass. And only when these come into their reproductive, when they really get into the reproductive phase, when they get these big seed heads, they become a bit less palatable for the horse. So then C4 species. C4 species store their carbohydrates in the form of starch, and there's a bit of a different, there's another thing that we have to take into account when we're dealing with tropical species is that some of these species can accumulate high amounts of oxalates. Well, oxalates is one of those secondary compounds that I highlighted in the beginning, and these can bind calcium. So they already bind calcium in the plant, so they make kind of bondage with calcium, or you can find oxalate in a free form, and when it enters the bloodstream, so when it is ingested and enters the bloodstream, it can actually kind of make bonds with calcium in the blood, and this can cause, for instance, a condition called big head. So it can cause hypocalcemia, and that can be quite dangerous. So you need to, if you're dealing with some of these tropical species that accumulate high amounts of oxalate, we have here, for instance, an example, panic grass. You need to make sure that you balance it with like a mineral supplement. Also, tropical species can accumulate high amounts of non-structural carbohydrates. I have here again a couple. Rhodes grass generally is low, but only the early growth can be quite high in sugar. So if you're dealing with quite a lot of road grass, you just may have to be careful with that early growth when you're dealing with sugar-sensitive horses. And again, I have here a couple of examples that you may find in tropical or subtropical horse or pastures in general. And the species that could be used for horse pastures are paspalum, creeping blue, and Yarrow digit grass. So particular Yarrow digit grass is quite popular to have in horse pastures. And here we have paspalum. I think most will be familiar with this species, and it generally grows together with like ryegrass. So you can get this one in a subtropical or temperate region as well. And then this one, Ceteria, is also one of those species that accumulate high amounts of oxalates. So also when we're dealing with these monoculture Ceteria-based pastures, we need to add calcium to the diet of horses. Okay, well, let's finish off with this section on native pasture species, and this is where I want to come back to that question. So indeed, native pastures or Australian native species are indeed lower in non-structural carbohydrates. They are also lower in oxalates, and this makes them a really interesting, makes them interesting grass species to have in our horse pasture. However, there is a bit of a catch. Because they are lower in sugars, they are more susceptible to overgrazing. So if you want to have a full native pasture, you need to be very aware that this needs to be managed in a very strict way, where you look at leaf area, and that you have a strict grazing planning, and that you have enough cells. So when we're talking about cell grazing or rotational grazing, that you have enough ability to move your horses through your property, so that you can allow these plants to recover. However, there are some species that have been cultivated for more of a purpose of grazing. That's particular red grass, very popular with sheep properties. So there are some species that are really more adapted for grazing. So red grass is one of those that could be used very well also in horse pasture. Queensland bluegrass, windmill grass, and most will be familiar with kangaroo. Although this, when it gets to these seeds, it generally gets a little bit less tasty for horses, and so you want to make sure that you have a variety of species, so that you're not, if at any stage you have a little bit of overgrazing, that the plants, that you have a variety of plants to reduce that one plant is affected by the overgrazing, and also that it allows to recover again, because it's always about leaf area, and recovery time is very important. So what are the best grasses for horse properties? It is really about a variety of all of these, depending on your climate. So either temperate imported or introduced species, including C3 temperate, or native, or you have a combination of all of them if you're in a kind of subtropical system. So there is I don't necessarily think that only natives is the answer, particularly on small, or if you're managing horses in a very intensive way. If you have a lot of acreage and you can have, you can rotate horses more often, or you have more cells, then yeah, absolutely, it is possible to keep horses purely on native pastures. And this really highlights why we should aim for biodiversity in our horse pastures. So, did I answer? I hope I answered that question on native grasses.
Hi, Mariette. We've just got two questions relating to that last section. How much grazing on tropical C4 grasses would be problematic for horses?
So with C4 grasses, when we have species that are accumulating these, or that can accumulate these oxalates, it is very important that you supply a calcium supplement. And if you have enough, if you balance that enough, then your horse can just graze on it without any problems. But at any stage when the horse is not getting enough calcium, then then you can put your horse at risk of this hypercalcemia. So you have to make sure that you have always either free choice available, or that you always feed some called rage imbalance, so that you have some pellets that have minerals in there. So there's actually no problem. Actually, horses can eat Ceteria and can eat all the other like panic grass and kikuya and couch, but there's an availability of calcium that is the limiting factor. And also the palatability, so it depends a little bit on the palatability of some of these species, as well as the sugar. So it's kind of a bit of a balance between them. So there is no limit to what they can, how much they can graze, as long as there is calcium availability for the horse.
Okay, thank you, Mariette. I've got one more question which may have been partially covered. If rehabilitating traditional improved pastures into sustainable forage paddocks in a temperate environment, I've been told that horses need 40 different species to balance their diet. Native grasses won't sustain consistent grazing, only sporadic grazing. So what other grass, legume and herbaceous species are needed for genuine biodiversity?
Yeah, that's a very good one. My answer is generally whatever plant can occupy your habitat. So if you create the right soils, you will invite the right species, and that can be from little creeping herbaceous plants. So, for instance, in the north we have like pinto peanut, like in the tropical system, pinto peanut, lucerne, clover. Any of those can be useful. And then we have our bunch grasses. So any of the species that I highlighted, those imported species, so prairie grass, for instance, is a very nice one to integrate in C3 systems, as well as your C3 native grasses. So it is really adding a variety of species, but generally you need to start from the soil. So if you create the right soil, you will be able to invite species that you would like. And the thing is that if you have enough availability, then it doesn't matter that, for instance, is a thistle or one of those plants where we consider not good for horses, because if you have variety, the horse will be able to utilize all of them without getting sick on it. And that's what I wanted to highlight, and that's what we're going into now, is this, what is the benefits of having biodiversity.
Thank you, Mariette. Probably fine to move on.
Yes, we'll actually come back to that question, as I said, and back to that satiety theory slide. And I think that it would be nice to kind of spend some time how to relate this to, like, for instance, smell, taste, and this post-ingestive feedback idea of work that I'm doing. So, biodiversity. Biodiversity has become a real buzzword, and but what does it mean, and why is it so important? Why do I address it so much in horse pastures, or anybody? You open, you open a book, or you Google on the internet pasture management, and you can see, you will find biodiversity. So what is it? It's a term given to a variety of life on Earth, and it's the variety within and between all species of plants, animals, and microorganisms, including ecosystem where these, where this life is interacting. So there are many. I just wanted to highlight this slide because it just gives us a perspective that there are millions of different species that live on this planet, from plants, and I highlighted here different animals, and all of these species form unique communities and interact with one another in air and water and in soil. So this is great. Like biodiversity, you probably understand that more is better, but what does it actually mean on your farm? So in pastures. So how does biodiversity support farms? And I have here a nice graph where I'm linking biodiversity with some very important aspects that we would like to have on our property. So the first one is to create healthy soils. And to create healthy soils, you need soil microorganisms and plant roots, because that is kind of a niche for these soil organisms, because at the root level, there's a lot of interaction happening with symbiotic bacteria as well as with fungi. They actually help with bringing nutrients. It's not the soil that you're feeding. You're actually feeding through a process of organic breakdown and microorganisms. That's how you feed the plant. So there is exchange, so symbiotic relationships where, for instance, if we take fungi, they exchange carbohydrates, or the plant is exchanging carbohydrates for instance, a mineral or even water. So these systems are very important to create healthy soils. And not a lot of, and I think there is now a movement, is soil health and soil development and soil carbon. I think that everybody is quite aware of it, but it's been only in the last 25 years that a lot of work, and there's still not a lot known about these soil organisms. There's so many, and we're still figuring out which symbiotic relationships are important. But fungi is one of those that is quite interesting. You never thought how exciting fungi can be, but yeah, it's quite good to have that in your soils. Then, of course, water is very important. Having enough or having better water retention, and to be able to have and to hold water, you really require good ground cover. You need many roots of perennials, and this will help you with storage. But also it's about what I already highlighted, this compaction. You really would like to have aerated soil so that water can soak into deeper layers. Then pollination. I think that there's actually a couple of movies now out, documentaries really highlighting what is happening to our bees and our pollinators. And these documentaries generally highlight the effect of insecticides on these animals, and that this really affects this pollination. For instance, the fig. There is a fig here in Australia that is having quite a lot of trouble, and it's actually endangered. You may have never thought about it, but it really causes biodiversity loss. So having systems in place where you encourage pollination is very important. And when we see bats, we always think very badly about these animals, but there are microbats that are really important in this pollination process, but also fruit bats. And I hope that we're not seeing them as bad things. Also, water recycling, coming back into retention, we need indeed the roots, but also our soil organisms, they really hold water as well, and they recycle water. And the other organism or plant that is really important in water cycling is trees. So I didn't highlight it, but trees play an important role in hydrating our properties and our soils. Then nutrient recycling. Well, to have good nutrient recycling, we need legumes to recycle nitrogen. Also, don't forget grazing animals. So the return of manure and urine is very important. And of course, organic matter. So we need to have breakdown of organic matter, and together with soil organisms, which will allow us to make and build soil. So kind of creating humus, and you're probably aware of this. But it all links. It's not separate, but it is a very important aspect to have a variety of legumes and soil microbiology to recycle nutrients in our soils. And then last, pest control. I think that this is probably also on grass level, but definitely if you're dealing with crops, having native vegetation and beneficial insects to avoid, I think it's also diversity of vegetation to avoid that particular one plant can be affected by a pest. And that's also one of the reasons why we have a variety of plants in our system, is to reduce disease and to reduce reduce pests and reduce diseases in plants. The other thing that you may have not thought about, but biodiversity also plays a role on animal level. So here I'm having a slide where you see on one side animals that are inexperienced, so they're in a monoculture situation and they're only exposed to, say, 2 plants. And then we have the other side of the on the other side of the slide, I'm saying, well, these animals are experienced. They have a lot of species, and they will also learn a lot about mix and matching species based not only on nutrients, but particularly these toxins. So you're actually making, well, almost animals more streetwise, and so you will reduce this potential of toxicosis, which are highlighted in the beginning when we're talking about toxin and poisoning. Also, a lot of people think that herbivores know what they should eat, and that this is innate. So we kind of go, well, my horse knows what to eat. But this is actually not the case. Research has shown that in the case with grazing animals, they learn to eat the different plants they learn it from their mom and from their peers. And so, as you can understand, if the horse was only exposed to a monoculture system, it's an experience, and there will be a high chance of this toxicosis, particularly if we move them to an unfamiliar environment. And I'm not so sure if you have personal experience where you may have moved an animal from, we see it generally when it goes from a temperate system to a tropical system, that can cause some issues. So we really need to train animals. You cannot chuck them into a paddock. You may have to introduce them in small lots, so you make sure that the animal is familiar with certain plants, and then you slowly introduce them to areas where they may have to start sampling new forages. Especially when we're dealing with bush environments and browse, that's generally the way where you kind of allow the animal to have a bit of a taste, but it still has its familiar food. So it is really what I call food training, and I'm not so sure if you really thought about it, but it really helps with not only the idea of having more choice for the horse, but you need to allow the animal to sample everything, and by slowly introducing it to a variety of species, this will really help. There are some tricks. You may be familiar. Sometimes people spray molasses on certain plants to make the animals eat certain areas. However, you have to be careful with that you're not forcing the animal to eat something just because you want to have that area grazed down. So it's never about forcing animals to plants. It's about inviting them to eat a variety, because then what we get is more even grazing through our paddock, and so we will then favor all of the species rather than just one species. And I think you may be quite familiar with that concept that horses can be quite selective. So it's a very interesting concept, and I can elaborate a little bit more on the work that I'm doing. I want to just finish up with this summary, so that we're on time, that we have some time to ask more questions or go back to certain things. So here I just want to highlight the coming back to kind of varieties, the spice of life, and not only by allowing animals to have more choice, they actually will also increase their intake. So having more option, animals actually will also increase the intake, and that's important, particular when we're dealing with growing animals and kind of breeding animals. So the other thing is that just thinking about you having like eating every day the same food, like if you would eat every day pizza, you will not be very happy. And we see that in grazing animals. They will get sick and tired of eating the same food. And I really see this with horses that are continuous on a lucerne-based diet. We do have to offer horses a variety of things, some things that may be very palatable and some that may not be as palatable. And you will see that horses will mix and match. They don't always want to eat the good stuff, except some ponies. And it seems to be very hard to understand why some species, some breeds of horses will pretty much eat themselves to death. And that's where my research is looking into these post-ingestive feedback mechanisms. And this regulation of feed intake. It's very complex, but generally in a healthy animal, animals will make good, well, generally good diet choices and avoid over-ingestion of particular foods, either based on nutrients or on these toxins. Also, having more options and having good nutritious food will help with animals eating more toxins. So herbivores can eat more secondary compounds if they have really nutritious food. So if you have, well, lucerne is a nutritious food. So if you have lucerne, then it can, for instance, deal with, for instance, species that can have a little bit more alkaloids or cyanides in the plant. Also, we're all individuals, even animals, and I think that everybody agrees that when you have multiple horses, each horse selects a bit different. You may see your horse in the pasture, and they all have a little bit different behavior. If you would look at them individually, some will graze in certain areas, the other moves more, the other one is more stationary. And you also see that when you give concentrates or commercial feeds, you will also see some preferences like certain smells or certain textures. Yeah, more is better. I think that, that we already highlighted that with biodiversity, giving animals more choice. And also with the individual patches, sorry to come back, is that formulating diets can be quite difficult because we make a palette for a group of horses, but each animal may have a different need on each day, and so sometimes it's better to have that free choice system to allow animals to select their nutrients. And it will be hard to do that with concentrates because generally they will overeat on very sugary food, but in a pasture environment, having this variety will allow animals to select their own nutrition, what they need, and they will be able to avoid toxins. So I hope that I really addressed that importance of biodiversity, and that there is no particular species that I can suggest that is great for horse pasture. It's just a combination of everything, and just having soils, good soils. If you focus on the soils and on your microorganisms, you will invite the right species, because weeds cannot grow in healthy soils non-stop. So more than happy to take more questions. I hope I kept to the time, so it's 8:30.
Thank you, Mariette. We might just have 2 more questions, and then the rest I can email to you, and you can answer them, if possible, after the webinar. First question is biochar. Can it be used effectively and safely on horse grazing paddocks?
Yes. So biochar is just a very compacted carbon, so almost like a coal, and has very nutritional, it's rich in minerals, and can be used indeed as a addition to improve your soil. And you can graze animals quite quickly after using it. Like a compost, when you use compost that is made in a proper way by hot composting, when it's finished, when it went through underwent this aerobic process, it can be spread on the pasture just before a rain sets in, and then the next couple of days you can already start grazing your horse, because what you return is just soil. Whether if you harrow and you just spread feces, then we have a total different story. So indeed, so biochar is great, and it's safe to allow horses back on for grazing.
Okay, we'll just have one last question. A very general question, but how big can you go with a permaculture model? All the books talk about small acreage, and it appears to be very intense to establish initially. Can you realistically create a 100-acre permaculture model for horses?
Yes, you can. I have a demonstration site of a client of mine that has 80 acres, and we're now probably in the 4th year with that, And we already slowly are developing certain segments in that, but it will take time. So it is possible, but then there is a money and time aspect that we need to consider. With the permaculture idea, we always try to manage that, well, the least change for the maximum output. And generally what permaculture is about is really start at the door, you know, at the, when you go into your garden, so at the doorstep, that's where you start. So then you kind of spread out. Also, you need to prioritize which areas are most important to you and you want to enjoy for you know, on a short-term basis, and then intermediate, and then long-term. So you really need to divide it and then focus on those areas. So for instance, your kitchen garden, then maybe your cropping area, and then your grazing area. For horses, maybe the main, or for your grazing animals, so horses, and maybe you have other animals. But you are able, within 5 years, to set up something that really ticks all the boxes of a permaculture system. However, to spread that and to all areas, including food forestry. Generally, food forest, once set up, it's low maintenance. But when you get to your food forest and managing larger areas of grazing land, yeah, you may have to add another 5 years to your plan. So it's definitely a 10-year program, depending on your time and, of course, money. So you either need time, money, or ideally a combination. But you can do it on a low budget. So it really depends on being creative and making the smallest changes first to have that already have some gain out of that. And to have some books on it, there's actually most of the permaculture books are focused indeed on urban and semi-urban settings. Yeah, we are getting now more interest, and on the permaculture blog, so on the permaculturenews.org, you can find case studies and articles of people that are dealing with what we call farmscaping, so permaculture on farmscaping level. So I'm more than happy to add some links for this person and for people to visit that. And just to highlight that, actually that's quite an exciting news that I have, is that at the end of this year, beginning of next year, I am launching an equine permaculture blog and site, where I'm going to allow people to blog and interview people that are trying to set up a equine permaculture property. So hopefully then I can direct these people to more practical tips, and where also people can share their experiences. So it becomes kind of a well, it's kind of a meeting place where people can share information, and hopefully we'll run some permaculture workshops. So that will be launched hopefully early next year, and then I can direct people and say, well, why don't you check these sites and contact these people, where you can maybe visit them and see it in action, because I think having demonstration sites is kind of lacking. We're lacking demonstration sites to really show it in action.
Thank you, Mariette. Might just finish off with a closing slide.
Yeah, just, well, I think I've talked way too much, and I may have confused many more people, but please come and follow us on Facebook. As I said, I'm really excited about launching this permaculture-based blog, where I really kind of allow people to give their experience rather than me talking. It's great to hear it from other people, and that we spread the message as together, because it's not by me, it's by everybody if we want to create more sustainable horse properties. I hope to see you on the Facebook page, and also on my website there's so much more information about my research or workshops, and also some free educational articles. So please visit and join the page, and then some future workshops, and there's also the option for purchasing the equine permaculture book. So if you're interested in owning one, please let Julie know. We have copies available, and we have more seminars coming up. The next one will follow on to regenerative solutions for pasture problems. So we'll discuss some of the pasture problems, so go more into overgrazing and compaction and some strategies. So I'm going to give a bit of a brief overview of some main and effective strategies for regenerating some of your pasture. Then we have one that continues on composting, which is a really important one. If we want to regenerate our property or our pastures, we really need to think about soil building, and composting is great. It can be done very simple, and it doesn't cost a lot because you already have your manure there. We just have to put, kind of be a bit of a master chef and put everything together. So that's on in January, and then we finish off with trying to link how much does, what the contributions are of pasture to the requirements of horses, and how can we balance that with supplementary feeding. I think that's one of the biggest questions. So how much should I feed, because I not always know how much my horse is getting from pasture. So in that webinar, we'll go through certain estimations for us to guide us into, correct supplementary feeding, and also to reduce feed costs. So hopefully we'll go into that in a bit more detail. That's in February. And for more information, Julie will probably also provide this link in the horses event, in the event page. And I think there will be a link provided in the email as well. So
yes. Well, thank you very much, Mariette. And thank you very much, everybody, for contributing your questions. As mentioned earlier, for the questions that are not answered, they'll be emailed to Mariette to address after the webinar in the next coming days. We'd also like to thank the Natural Resources, Adelaide and Mount Lofty Ranges for sponsoring this seminar. Thank you again.